The arrest of such a man could not at any rate have been attended with important consequences. His mission could have been productive of no advantage, and had as yet no other character than that of an obscure intrigue. I have always been of opinion that Monsieur de Talleyrand was aware of it, but he had certainly not seen him before his departure. I will presently explain myself. In the midst of this apparent state of political dissolution, the reality of which was but too obvious, General Régnier returned to Paris. The reader will recollect that he had been taken prisoner at Leipzig and recently exchanged. He had passed through the headquarters of the Allied sovereigns, to whom he had the honor of being presented previously to his being sent to the headquarters of our own army. The Emperor of Austria, in admitting him to his presence, recommended that he should advise the Emperor to profit by the lessons which he himself had received from him, and to follow his own example by treating for peace on any terms, as otherwise it would be out of his, the Emperor of Austria's, power to do anything more in favor of his daughter and of his grandson. The Emperor Alexander gave a most friendly reception to General Régnier. The latter asked, in the course of conversation, whether His Majesty would not confide some message to him for the Emperor Napoleon, whom he was about to join, who would know that he had been honored with an interview. The Emperor Alexander replied in the negative, that he had personal grounds for complaint and felt no inclination to come to any amicable terms with him. The conversation was prolonged, and upon the remark made by General Régnier that the Emperor was the chief of the state, the Emperor Alexander replied, but that chief has been raised by yourselves, meaning the army, to his present dignity, and if you are called upon to adopt another, what objection could you have to a course which would enable you to be at peace with all the world? General Régnier replied that independently of the circumstance that no one could be found as a proper substitute for the Emperor, the Allied sovereigns would be justified in entertaining a very poor opinion of a people who could be capable of so readily deserting a prince whose elevation they had so solemnly proclaimed. The Emperor of Russia stated in answer that the nation would have no reproach to make to itself for yielding to the force of circumstances, that with respect to a choice, it seems already pointed out by the suffrage which the Emperor Napoleon had given to the military man, whom he had no doubt considered as the most calculated for a throne, and he mentioned Bernadotte by name. General Régnier replied in a becoming manner, without indulging in any reflection at all disparaging to Marshal Bernadotte. He asked permission to take leave and return to Paris, where he related to me the above conversation. There is unquestionably sufficient evidence, according to the report made by General Régnier, that the object of the Emperor of Russia was to hurl the Emperor Napoleon from his throne. The pacific language ascribed to the Allies at Châtillon was nothing more than a feint, and there is injustice in the assertion that it was in the power of the Emperor to have obtained terms of peace at the conferences held there. I reported this conversation to the Emperor on the same day, and he did me the honor to reply that he wished to speak with General Régnier. The general started off as fast as his horse could carry him, that he might be the sooner with the Emperor. But when he had reached the second stage of his journey, he was attacked with so violent a fever that it was found necessary to convey him back to Paris in a state of high perspiration, followed by a general chillness all over the body, and subsequently by an inflammatory complaint, which in a few days terminated his existence. The Emperor had not, therefore, an opportunity of seeing him. The hostile armies had approached to within so short a distance of Paris that it was impossible to prevent the constant ingress and egress, which must necessarily take place under favor of the confusion attendant upon the proximity of an army, independently of which the communication between London and Châtillon passed through Paris. In conformity with an arrangement previously agreed upon, the superiority of the Allies, therefore, and the designs which they meditated could hardly be kept a secret from the inhabitants. Malevolence was accordingly stimulated to fresh exertions, and a general alarm was spread in the provinces. I had not waited until that evil was beyond a remedy to render to the Emperor an account of what I beheld. of what was reported to me, and of what I anticipated, unless he made peace upon any terms that might be dictated to him. The armistice had not yet expired. It was natural for me to apprehend that my report might fall into the enemy's hands, and make them acquainted with the existing state of things, which it was of the utmost importance to conceal from their view. I therefore abstained from committing my opinions to paper in a case of so much delicacy, but availed myself of the return to the army of an officer of first-rate merit, who was well known to the emperor, and I repeated to him over and over again that I was anxious he should tell that prince in my name. He faithfully discharged his mission. Of this I possess an undeniable proof. Seeing, however, that this course was not productive of the desired effect, I determined to write to the emperor and make him acquainted with the state of uneasiness to which I was a prey, and which I deemed but too well founded, and I requested that, as the last proof of attachment I might ever have it in my power to afford him, I might be allowed to remain in Paris in the capacity of his commissioner during the approaching occupation of the capital by the allied troops. I pressed upon his consideration that it was useless to deceive himself respecting the consequences of so fatal an event, but that a man who should devote himself for his cause might encourage by his example all those who, having it in their power to shelter their responsibility under the cloak of his authority, would at least evince a perfect indifference to what might be demanded of them, and that the first spark of a courageous opposition in such an emergency would keep many people in the path of honor and induce them to listen to the voice of duty. I showed my letter to the Arch-Chancellor, as well as to M. Pesquier, who had called upon me at the moment of my closing it. We had conversed together on the subject of my fears, and he was as well persuaded as myself of the reality of the approaching danger. The emperor did me the honor to reply in the most flattering language to the proposal I had submitted to him, but he did not coincide in opinion with me as to what I fancied I might have it in my power to do for his service. He even said that, for my own sake, he required I should leave Paris, adding that I should be exposed to the most serious personal misfortunes if I placed myself in the power of the enemy. I was therefore under the necessity of abandoning my plan, because had I failed of success, I could have urged no excuse after evading an order so pointedly given to me. The idea of self-preservation appeared the only prevalent one. The emperor was pitied, but his misfortunes were gradually deserted by all. Some of the commissioners who had been sent out to rouse the public spirit in the departments had almost ceased to keep up correspondence, and merely communicated that their efforts would be unavailing. Public energy was nowhere to be found. The political agony was complete. Some of those commissioners even endeavored to secure to themselves a new position by claiming it as a title to praise on their part that they had evaded the orders received from the emperor's ministers. Chapter 30. During this painful crisis, I received orders to arrest the Marquis de Rivière, in consequence, no doubt, of some reports sent from the province of Savary, where M. de Simonville had been dispatched as the emperor's commissioner. I have always been under the impression that he had suggested this measure by a direct application to the emperor's closet, for there was little leisure or inclination in the camp to attend to M. de Rivière's proceedings. Malevolence had long been on the watch for opportunities of persuading the emperor that the superintendence exercised by the minister of police was ineffectual, in order that whenever a favorable moment, which was eagerly sought for, should occur, a mass of petty anecdotes might be brought forward by way of inducing him to change his minister. Nevertheless, I had heard of all the proceedings of M. de Rivière in the province of Berry, and had written to M. de Simonville, as well as to M. Didelot, who was prefect of the department. It was not, I believe, until the first-named person saw that I had my eyes open to what was going forward, that he had determined to write with the view of screening himself from reproach. But when he received the order for M. de Rivière's arrest, which was the consequence of his report, our affairs had grown desperate, and he did not carry it into effect. I only relate this anecdote as illustrating what I have just asserted, an assertion farther borne out by the following observation in M. de Rivière's own handwriting, that M. de Simonville would have executed the orders I had given him had he not made it evident to him that he was serving the cause of God and of justice. I must also acknowledge that I took little notice of Monsieur de Rivière, trusting that he would keep the word of honor he had given me when he pledged himself in avoiding acting in part calculated to disturb the public peace. I was the more justified in relying upon his assurances, as at the time when misfortunes weighed most heavily upon him, he addressed to me the following words: "Sir, I hold myself so much indebted to the Emperor that if the Comte d'Artois were to make his appearance tomorrow in the plain of Grenelle at the head of 100,000 men, I should abstain from joining him." To this reply, Monsieur de Rivière, which I repeated to the Emperor, he was indebted for the gradual mitigation of severity which he experienced in his unhappy situation. For the Emperor was always disposed to trust to the honor of those who had given proofs of high feelings. He therefore relied upon the honor of a man who, after having served the cause of his own prince with so much attachment, could spontaneously assert that he renounced it of his own accord. Any ill treatment shown to him from that moment would have been an act of cruelty. Monsieur de Rivière, however, did not wait until the Count d'Artois had 100,000 men under his orders, or until he had reached the plain of Grenelle, since he acknowledged that he would infallibly have been arrested had he not proved to Monsieur de Semonville that he was serving the cause of God and of justice. In the first days of the month of March, Prince Joseph had, with the Emperor's permission, sent an agent to the Crown Prince of Sweden, who had recently joined his army in the neighborhood of Montbouge or Liège. The object of the mission was to learn from the Crown Prince by what means the Allies could be prevailed upon to grant a peace on reasonable conditions. That agent had returned with an answer which was but too strong a confirmation of the evil presentiments already entertained. Bernadotte announced that the discussion now rested upon the question of depriving the Emperor of his power. He recommended that a negotiation should be entered into upon that preliminary basis, as if the enemy should once enter Paris, nothing more would remain to be done, because the Bourbon would then be restored to the throne. This message remained a secret. It was, however, sent to the Emperor, who had no longer any doubt respecting the views of the allied sovereigns. He plainly saw that whilst they accused him of an unwillingness to make peace, conditions were offered for his acceptance which would be the source of a future war, or rather which would have the effect of allowing breathing time to the enemy and enabling them to complete in the following campaign what they had not the power to effect in the present one. Nevertheless, the Emperor did not come to a determination without taking advice, for I recollect his sending to his brother Joseph the conditions which it was intended to impose upon him. He desired him to assemble a council. I do not recollect whether it was a council of the Regency or a council of ministers, to lay those conditions before, collect the votes, and transmit them to him. Illness prevented my attending the council, but Monsieur Molay, who called upon me after it had broke up, gave me a summary of the subject under discussion. I cannot therefore give a more detailed account of it. The enemy required the yielding up of all the conquests purchased by France at the price of so much blood, and demanded moreover, as guarantees for the fulfillment of this condition, the cession of Besançon and of some other fortified towns along the first line of our frontiers, which would thereby have been leaving us wholly unprotected. This could not be termed a peace. Such was the unanimous opinion of the council. The Emperor did not disguise from himself that these proposals were nothing else but a snare laid for him. He was convinced that the allied sovereigns had already decided upon the course they should adopt, and that all the terms proposed to him were mere subterfuges resorted to for the purpose of degrading him in the eyes of the nation. He preferred perishing with arms in his hands rather than submit to such ignominious terms, which eventually the enemy might not have the power to enforce. The object of his being offered terms wholly inadmissible, and yet calculated to confirm the opinion industriously circulated that he was unwilling to make peace, was probably to be ascribed to the conviction entertained of his character, which could never brook an insult. It was plainly received that the enemy had no expectation that a plan which they were so slow in promoting could ever be brought to a conclusion. Nevertheless, they had not yet ventured to speak openly of their views respecting a change of dynasty. Had the emperor found at this period as much zeal in his service as he had a right to expect, he ought to have been joined by the different corps composing the army of Spain, or they ought at least to have been already on the upper Loire. If he had had this force at his command, he would have crushed the Russians and Prussians as well as the confederated powers. His former friends, the Austrians, would then have entered into a separate treaty, as it was known beyond a doubt that the Emperor of Austria was opposed to the advance upon Paris, an objection probably ascribable to the interest he took in his daughter's fate. Misfortune would have it that in consequence of an offensive movement of our army upon the upper Seine, he left the headquarters of the Allies, retired into Burgundy, and never made his appearance again at the camp, so that the Emperor Alexander and the King of Prussia remained the arbiters of the future destiny of France, and brought the ministers and generals of the Emperor of Austria to fall in with their views. There were just grounds for believing that the absence of the Emperor of Austria was premeditated, since the documents emanating from his cabinet plainly indicated a remnant of affection for the Empress. He had never ceased to protest that he would not separate the cause of his daughter and his grandson from that of France. He had confided to the sovereign who wielded the scepter of that country, the child of his dearest affection. He tenderly loved his daughter. He deeply deplored her being exposed to fresh uneasiness. It was painful for him to find that Napoleon should refuse to acknowledge the friendly intentions of his cabinet. These expressions of kind interest, this feeling of tender pity, had no doubt alarmed those who had decreed the downfall of Napoleon. They were unwilling to expose themselves to the consequences of a change of sentiments on the part of a father who had shown a disposition to sacrifice his own daughter. They deemed it more prudent to remove him from the scene of action. I have asserted that the emperor might have obtained the assistance of the army of Spain. It remains to be told how he came to be deprived of it. It has already been stated that the Duc de Bassano had opened negotiations with Valenciennes. Secrecy alone could ensure their success, and every means had been adopted to prevent the proceedings from being made public. Nevertheless, they had not been brought to a close before everything had transpired. The party who were conspiring against the emperor took the alarm, and such was the power of their influence that they succeeded in representing this measure of safety as the death blow of our political institutions. The minister, whose duty it was to watch their movements, caught the infectious spirit and was so blinded by his fears as to throw himself at the emperor's feet and urge him to abandon a project which he said would completely destroy the fascination still working in our favor. He was harshly rebuked by the emperor, but as this minister's movements afforded a key to the policy of the state, the English had been put on their guard, and it was no longer easy to give effect to a measure which did not at first present any obstacle to its accomplishment. The tide of events was hurrying on, and it was no longer doubted that everything had been prepared beyond the Pyrenees to obstruct the success of an object which must have been fatal to the plans of the allied sovereigns. Sufficient importance was not attached to an act the conclusion of which should have been accelerated with a view to the emperor's interest. The period of the expiration of the armistice was fastly approaching, and yet the contemplated treaty was not followed up. I addressed a letter to the emperor on this subject, stating that when the negotiations of Valenciennes were first set on foot, everyone had expected that they would at least be productive of the advantage of enabling him to call the army of Spain to his assistance. But this hope had been wholly relinquished, since no part of the transaction, not even the departure of the princes, had been carried into effect. I cannot take upon myself to say whether my letter answered the purpose intended, but the emperor issued orders, courier after courier, for Ferdinand's departure, a proof that this formed the principal feature in the object he had in view, and that, if the case had been properly pressed upon his attention, he would have been brought so effectually to a close as to enable him to dispose of his army on the frontiers of Spain in a manner more profitable to his service. The Spanish princes quitted Valencia on the 19th of March, and on their return to Spain through the town of Perpignan, and on the 22nd of the same month, the armistice was declared at an end. Hitherto, the spirit of intrigue had been dormant in Paris, or at least it had acted with great circumspection. It had nevertheless found means of opening a communication with the Allies, and had perhaps succeeded in urging them to break off the negotiations at Châtillon and march upon Paris. The more I sought to penetrate through its obscurity, the greater became my conviction that it only waited for an assurance of support to develop its projects, which could never be otherwise than dependent upon the will of the Allied sovereigns. So long as there was a probability that the latter would enter into a treaty, it did not break out into any open declaration. At last the expected moment arrived. All the persons employed in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who had been called to Châtillon, as well as to the Emperor's headquarters during the time of the conferences, were now returning to Paris. Amongst the number was Monsieur de la Bernardière, who had been entrusted with the management of the negotiation. He had been too long and too deeply practiced in state affairs to be mistaken as to the real views of the Allies. It was through him that Monsieur de Talleyrand obtained a knowledge of everything that had been done at Châtillon, ascertained at a later period that this diplomatist had held communications of a direct nature with a more elevated personage. But what he had learned from Monsieur de la Bernardière, the rupture of the armistice, as well as of the conferences, proved that the assurances made to him were not empty words. From that moment he became more confident, and only dreamed of accelerating a revolution of which he had long prepared the elements, though he had not made up his mind as to the particular direction he should give to it. However, fully determined that it should accomplish the overthrow of the empire, everything was perfectly quiet in the provinces. Paris was the seat of action, and the signal to be given by the Allies was anxiously awaited. If the cause was honestly supported, it may reasonably be asked why they did not sooner reach the capital. As for ourselves, we had already experienced the fatal effects of the measure we had adopted with respect to the local administrations, which were ordered to withdraw at the enemy's approach. We were almost in absolute ignorance of what had taken place in the invaded territory. The difficulty was such that when it became necessary to transmit to the blockaded towns orders addressed to them on the 19th of March by the Minister of War, they could only be sent by deserters. These orders were, however, of little consequence, for, supposing the Duke of Feltre had taken upon himself to point out a general rendezvous to the troops which were defending our fortresses, there was no time for them to reach it. It was at a moment of the passage of the Rhine by the hostile armies that the garrisons should have been called upon to assemble and brought into line, since the Allies did not stop before our fortified towns. I began to watch more narrowly Monsieur de Talleyrand, who spoke a language adapted to the sentiments of everyone, and who was, besides, the only center of attraction for men disposed to create a convulsion. His position was already laid down by a series of intrigues, respecting which he could not hope to practice any deception. There certainly did not exist any proof sufficiently strong to justify measures of severity against a man of his rank in the state, but disclosures would have been brought about by a peace. And Monsieur de Talleyrand was too shrewd not to know that the only danger for him was in stopping halfway. I therefore considered him as the man who was about to become the leader of a party against the emperor, though certainly not against the dynasty, springing out of a revolution in which he had acted so conspicuous a part. If he had found it necessary to make a stir, he had no occasion to wrap himself up in mystery, since the course of events was so evidently favoring his views. He was well aware of the resolution of the Allied sovereigns, and was attentively watching to find out on which side the edifice would give way. He sometimes called upon me, waited until my return if I happened to be out, and freely indulged in conversations in which he deplored the existing state of France. He compared it with her condition at the time of the peace of Tilsit, exclaiming that all this should have happened within the period of 6 years. He then launched out against the Duke of Bassano, spoke of adulation and flattery, and coming at last to the point, he said to me, "What are we to do in such afflicting circumstances?" It is not to be expected that everyone should remain in a house on fire. Be on your guard. Something will happen to you like the scene of the 23rd of October. You are aware there is in Burgundy a Marquis de La Salle who's very active and is raising partisans. This example will be contagious for other provinces. Monsieur de Talleyrand was quite right in what concerned the Marquis de La Salle. I was informed of his attempts and of their failure had it not been for the arrival of the enemy in Paris and the consequences of that event. Such means as those employed by the Marquis de La Salle would not have occasioned the defection of a single man of any consequence. Monsieur de Talleyrand did not desire it. He had a very different object in view from that in the execution of which he was compelled to concur by a variety of circumstances of which I shall afford some explanation to the reader. I strongly suspected that he derived his information respecting the proceedings of the Marquis from his friendly intercourse with a person who was on the most intimate terms with Monsieur de La Salle, and as in a period of revolution, when one has no farther occasion to think of self, one's friends are the next objects of attention. He would not allow me to be shipwrecked and was stretching out his hand to save me. I had a positive order to abstain from measures of severity and was therefore under the necessity of allowing him to run on. I affected not to understand, though in fact my curiosity was the more excited. His experience, however, was proof against the bait thus held out. I could obtain no positive information from him. I was correctly informed of all the visits he received, but his conduct was so artfully disguised that he could give it the appearance of being quite natural by successively receiving persons of every opinion and of all characters. I took care not to have one of them spoken to. The state of our affairs was far too desperate to induce any of those persons to renounce the court favors which they already anticipated the prospect of obtaining. What, besides, could they have told me of a conversation in which no positive fact could be discovered, or of their private opinion respecting the intentions of Monsieur de Talleyrand, which were in a great measure known to me? I was in this state of uneasiness when, happening to ride about town, it occurred to me to pass close by the Prince's Hotel. I descried from a great distance the carriage of the Archbishop of Mechlin, and imagined they were in close conference together. Being determined to satisfy myself on the subject, I dismounted in the street and walked in unexpectedly. Instead of having the folding door of the hotel thrown open to me, the porter recognized but had not the courage to stop me. I quickly ascended the staircase and reached Monsieur de Talleyrand's closet without meeting with anyone in the antechamber. He was in close conference with the Archbishop. I entered so suddenly that my appearance had as striking an effect upon them as if I had got in through the window. They stopped short in their conversation, which had been exceedingly animated. Both seemed to have suddenly lost the power of speech. The Archbishop's countenance, however, appeared the most discomposed. On perceiving their confusion, I guessed the subject to their conversation and could not help saying to them, "This time at least, you cannot deny it. I find you in the act of conspiring." I was right in my conjecture. They set up a laugh and endeavored to deceive me as to their intentions, but I requested them in vain to continue their conversation. They had lost the thread of it. I withdrew under the conviction that they were hatching some plot, though I was ignorant of its exact nature. Chapter 31. It will be recollected that the conferences were not broken off until the 20th of March. The news of this occurrence was received in Paris on the 22nd or 23rd, previously to the adoption of any unanimous course of proceeding towards the Allies. A delay of a few days was wanting, but this deemed to be of no avail, as it was easy to calculate the number of days which the enemy would require to reach the gates of the capital. Nevertheless, I was informed of the sudden arrival in Paris of Monsieur Adrien de Montmorency, upon whom I was keeping a strict watch, and who since late events was living with Madame de Chevreuse at his residence of Dompierre in the vicinity of Rambouillet. I sent for him, but he avoided the meeting. It was reported to me that he had seen Monsieur de Talleyrand, after which it was further asserted that he had returned to Dompierre. this was not the fact. He had made a long circuit to repair to the residence of the Comptoir. It was too late for this mission to be productive of any result. The person who was charged with it was, besides, of too prudent a character to incur fresh risks, or to venture himself without having a fair chance of success. His return was alone calculated to give rise to some serious inquiries, but the course of events brought the enemy to Paris before he re-entered it. I therefore retained my first opinion that everything was dependent upon events, and that the volcano would only explode after the decision of the Allied sovereigns should be made known. The work of intrigues continued. Some took a part in them with the intentions of making a disclosure to the police. If they failed of success, others to make them the grounds for courting favors if they should prove successful. The object of all was to worship at the shrine of the new chief who might be presented to them. This deplorable state of things was to be ascribed to the low ebb of our affairs, of which it was beyond the reach of common understandings to form a correct notion. In a crisis like the present, I was rejoiced that Monsieur Fouché was not in Paris, because he would not have failed coming to terms with the strongest party and betraying all the rest in order to secure his individual prospects. In consequence of the events which had occurred in Italy, he had returned with Princess Eliza to the southern departments, to the senatorship of Arles, if I recollect rightly, and he there waited for the issue of the events which obscured the political horizon. The rupture of the conferences by spreading alarm in the public mind had the effect of again bringing to Paris a superabundance of population consisting of those people from the country who had given way to fear. Everyone related the tales which his alarm had magnified into realities, and many fools were found to credit them. There would have been madness in attempting to prevent this idle talk which I allowed to go on, the rather so as I had not the means of preventing it. Had the disaffected undertaken anything, I had not the power to oppose them, and the slightest display of severity would have been the signal for a general rising. Paris had become the only point which afforded any shelter. Everywhere else apprehension was felt in coming into contact with foreign enemies or witnessing disturbances which seemed to be the necessary consequence of their approach. The first operation that followed the resumption of hostilities began by a movement in the direction of the river Oise. The enemy had reinforced themselves in that quarter by the arrival of different corps of troops, which had already successfully crossed the Rhine from Holland as far as the neighborhood of Coblentz. The Emperor made an offensive movement upon Soissons, vigorously pressed the Allies, defeated them before Craon, and pursued them to the walls of Lyon, where he fought a disastrous battle. After a march and engagements which had lasted the whole day, our troops were recruiting from their fatigues when the enemy's cavalry rushed in upon them under the favor of night. They were unable to resist the shock, and disorders spread to the ranks. The corps of Marshal Marmont and the Duke of Padua respectively suffered very severe losses. The battle was, however, risked and proved so unsuccessful that we were compelled to retreat. The Emperor marched next upon Reims, which he entered after having driven back the Russians. The enemy's grand army had, in the meanwhile, resumed its march down the Seine in order to force us back upon Paris. The Emperor had been joined in the first-named town by some troops which he had drawn from the garrisons of Mézières and the adjoining towns. He drew near to the river Marne so as to be able to move towards the Aisne on his left and the Seine on his right. As I did not accompany the army, I never had more than an imperfect knowledge of the series of movements by which the Emperor had, ever since the month of January, kept in check an army upwards 5 times as numerous as his own. A calculation was made of the number of days he would still be able to resist. Compassion was felt for a hero who wanted nothing more than numerical strength to astonish the world by fresh prodigies of valor. On quitting the borders of the Aisne in order to move towards the Marne, he left the 2 corps of Marshal Marmont and Mortier upon that river and proceeded through Meaux for the purpose of forming a junction with that part of his army which was retreating by the right bank and descending the river Seine in consequence of the movement of the enemies. Grand Army commanded by the Emperor Alexander and the King of Prussia in person, the Emperor of Austria had remained in Burgundy, where it was no doubt suggested to him that he should fix his residence in order to free him from the odium of the measures they were about to undertake. The danger was so imminent that the Emperor was urged on all sides to anticipate the moment of the enemies entering Paris and to forestall them. Everyone asked him for instructions. He replied to all in such a manner as to inspire them with confidence, which he was far from entertaining. His pretended calmness and security had no longer the effect of dispelling the general alarm which fresh occurrences daily contributed to excite. It appears, however, that he had felt a conviction of the truth of all that had been represented to him, and that he had given to Prince Joseph certain positive orders in the event of the occurrence which he had himself anticipated, as will be hereafter seen. General and Marshals Mortier and Marmont, who had retired in the direction of Meaux, had just been attacked by superior forces and compelled to retreat before them, notwithstanding the unfavorable aspect of our affairs. The Emperor formed a plan of operation which might have repaired all our misfortunes. It would indeed have had the effect of disconcerting all his enemies and would probably have been attended with a successful result had it not been for the accidental circumstance I am about to relate. The Emperor, finding that his numerical strength was unequal to contend with the enemy, conceived the idea of concentrating his army and of forcing his way through the enemy in such a manner as to reach the heart of his fortified towns, of which he contemplated to collect the respective garrisons. As soon as he should reach Verdun, he could open a communication with them and with the places which filled up the intermediate space between that town and the fortresses of Metz and Strasbourg, which were only blockaded by inconsiderable forces. He was proceeding to carry into effect the above plan, which he had communicated to his brother Joseph, and he had given orders at the same time to Marshals Mortier and Marmont to follow him through the province of Champagne. They were to overtake him beyond Vitry by following the left bank of the Marne. When the Emperor had decided upon that movement, he had given directions in Paris for the detention of all the troops which might have been sent to join him, and he had particularly desired that preparations should be made for a defense of a few days, because as he calculated that the whole hostile army would follow him in the movement which he meditated, he expected that he should be able to return in time to Paris. If it should happen otherwise, it would then be evident that Paris was the bone of contention and that the Emperor would not remove to too great a distance in order to have it in his power to relieve it. We shall now see what actually came to pass. The Emperor never failed to keep up a correspondence with the Empress, and since the communications had become so difficult, he made use of a cipher for that purpose. He felt anxious when commencing his movement to quiet her apprehensions of the result that might attend it, and accordingly wrote to apprise her of his intention and to request at the same time that she would not be alarmed at remaining a few days without intelligence from him. Unfortunately, this letter was not in ciphers, but in a common handwriting, and owing to a still greater fatality, the courier who was the bearer of it, supposing that the French troops were still in possession of Meaux, proceeded in the direction of that town, where he fell with his dispatches into the power of the Allies. On the same day, Marshal Blucher sent a flag of truce to the advanced post with a letter for the Empress, to whom he enclosed one from the Emperor, which had been broken open. He assured her how highly flattered he was that this circumstance had afforded him the opportunity of laying at her feet the homage of his profound respect, etc. But still the Emperor's letter had been read. It dwelt upon the idea of his contemplated movement, and ended in these words: "This maneuver must either save me or accomplish my ruin." The Empress, who was possessed of great self-command, was careful at first to disguise the painful sensations which the perusal of this letter had occasioned her. She did not mention the subject to those who were about her person when she received it. At night, however, when I waited upon her in her saloon, she did me the honor to name me for her partner at cards. We had just sat down, but contrary to her custom, she did not allow the envelope of the pack to be broken, a proof that she was not inclined to play. She waited a moment until the company in the drawing room were all seated, and when the attention was no longer exclusively fixed upon her, she opened the conversation. She spoke at first about indifferent matters, and by degrees came to advert to the emperor, whom she always mentioned with the most lively interest. She sought, by indulging in the company of those she knew to be attached to him, to recover from the presentiments which were daily crowding upon her. She asked me if I had received any letters from the emperor, to which question I replied in the negative. Well, then, she said, I can supply you with some which I received this very morning. I could not help expressing my surprise and remarking to her that no courier had arrived. It is very true, she said, that no courier has arrived, and I shall astonish you still more when I inform you that a letter from the emperor has been sent to me by Marshal Blucher himself, who states that it was found amongst many others, of which a courier was the bearer when taken prisoner. To speak candidly to you, I am exceedingly uneasy, since I have reflected upon the consequences likely to arise from that accident. The emperor has always written to me in ciphers. Ever since his departure, all his letters thus ciphered have come safely to hand. The present letter, however, which is written in common handwriting, is the only one in which he speaks to me of his designs, and it happens to fall into the enemy's hands. There is in this circumstance a fatality which deeply afflicts me. The good sense of this princess had made her penetrate at once the most unpleasant consequences to which such an accident might lead, and she did not deceive herself, though she pretended to be persuaded of everything that was said with the view of quieting her alarms. This accident will, I think, satisfactorily explain what Lord Castlereagh intimated in the British Parliament when, on rendering to that assembly an account of the operation of the Allied armies in France, he stated that great indecision prevailed as to the propriety of a march to Paris until detailed communications of great importance were received at headquarters, which occasioned the determination to advance towards the capital. If that diplomatist did not allude to the letter written by the emperor to the empress, his expressions must have reference to communications brought by Monsieur de Vitrolles, who went to acquaint the enemy with the actual state of Paris and with the progress made by Messieurs de Talleyrand, d'Alberg, and others in the projects meditated against the emperor. Paris and all France have contracted a debt of sincere gratitude to him. An expectation was entertained for some time in Paris that the enemy would exclusively attend to the emperor's movements, so slow were all their proceedings. But this impression soon vanished when intelligence was brought that the enemy's grand army was marching through La Brie. All hope had not yet been abandoned when the report was spread that the Emperor Alexander and the King of Prussia had slept at Coulommiers, about 14 leagues from Paris, on the road which, after crossing through La Brie, comes to meet the river Marne at Lagny. There could no longer be any doubt of the fact, since some of the inhabitants of Coulommiers had left that town on their way to Paris after those two sovereigns had penetrated into their district. Multitudes of country people were flying in all directions on the enemy's approach and pouring into Paris, whose numerous population was almost the only protection remaining to it. The danger was pressing. The Minister of War, who was more especially concerned in this case, requested the Empress Regent to convoke a council in order that the situation of the state might be laid before it, and that he might save himself from blame. He procured the regent's authority to recall to Paris a corps of Marshal Mortier and Marmont, which were ready on their march to overtake the emperor. The order sent to them was received in time to be carried into effect, and these two corps arrived at Charenton on the very day when the enemy's grand army was driving before it in the rear of Clay. And on the road leading to Meaux, within 6 leagues of Paris, the whole corps which we had to protect us in that direction. The council which the Minister of War had called for met the same night at the Palace of the Tuileries. As this was the sitting in which a determination was taken which brought on the downfall of France, it is of importance that none of the details of its proceedings should be omitted. Chapter 32. Warned by the emperor's letter of the danger which threatened them, the enemy assembled a council in which the situation of the affairs was warmly discussed. Some were for marching upon Paris, others for retreating towards the Rhine. Each one urged those considerations which to him appeared of greatest weight. A feeling of hesitation was prevalent. Doubts were entertained as to what course should be adopted. When an emissary arrived with intelligence which removed this uncertainty, Alexander announced his determination of trusting everything to fortune. The whole army was immediately put in motion instead of falling back upon Chaumont. As the emperor had calculated, Schwarzenberg had penetrated beyond the Aue. Blucher had crossed the Aisne. The Allied armies had effected a junction and were advancing in a body upon Paris, an attempt they never would have made had the army of Spain been on its way to join the emperor. If instead of our troops being scattered over different parts of the territory, they had been brought into a compact mass, an army might have been collected far more formidable than that of the Allies, and composed of troops long accustomed to defeat them. In this respect, the emperor's service was ill attended to. An army should have been assembled to assist him, and he would then have given a good account of his foes. The council, which assembled at the Tuileries on the night already adverted to, was composed as follows: the Empress, Prince Joseph, Prince Benevento, the Arch-Chancellor, the Arch-Treasurer, the High Judge, Monsieur Molay, etc. The council assembled at 8:30. The regent occupied the chair of state. Prince Joseph, after having asked her permission, informed the council of the motive of its being convoked, and then said to the Duc de Feltre, Minister of War, that he was open to discussion. The latter gave an exact representation of the dangers that threatened the capital, which were so urgent, as I have already stated, that he had deemed it his duty to make the regent acquainted with the state of affairs, as he felt unwilling to take upon himself the responsibility of events. On establishing a comparison between the time which was necessary for the emperor to make his appearance and the proximity of the enemy to the capital, he saw no possibility of effectually resisting them. He enumerated what troops we had in Paris and its neighborhood, and represented that the corps of Marshal Mortier-Marmont had not yet arrived. If he abstained from any observation calculated to increase the prevailing anxiety, he said nothing that could allay it. He laid particular stress on every ground of alarm, but was silent as to our resources, and had not a word of consolation for our ears. He overlooked altogether the corps of upward of 10,000 men which occupied the road from Versailles to Vendôme, where he had sent them beforehand, having no doubt settled in his own mind the question of the departure of the Empress. He omitted, among other things, to notice the condition of the arsenal of Paris, which contained 54,000 muskets in complete repair. He was equally silent respecting a park of artillery of 250 pieces of cannon of different calibers, ready mounted upon carriages, with their ammunition caissons ready filled, and ranged with the guns in the Champ de Mars, independently of the artillery at the several barriers. But he carefully pointed out that the emperor had not left Paris a single disposable artillery horse, having successfully ordered to the army all those that had been collected. In this respect, the minister did not adhere to the truth. The artillery horses which the emperor had ordered from Paris to the army had been collected by means of the prefect of the Department of the Seine for the service of the artillery at the barriers, in case it had been found necessary to move it from one spot to another. But the Minister of War, who never allowed any means to escape him by which he could effect a display of greater zeal than anyone else, used every endeavor to persuade the emperor that he alone was competent to serve him, and of his own authority he removed from the prefecture of the Seine the draft horses, which that branch of the service has succeeded in collecting. On hearing the language of the Minister of War, it was difficult to avoid entertaining the most gloomy presentiments. His statement was a mixture of loyalty, prudence, adulation, and independence of mind, which was perfectly unintelligible. The real meaning of his words appeared to be, I have warned you of everything. I wash my hands of what may hereafter come to pass. Such a statement was not calculated to inspire confidence in those who were strangers to military operations, who could feel any degree of hope. When the Duc de Feltre was heard to despair of the efficiency of the resources remaining at his command, I am at a loss to account for the motives that induced him to darken a picture which was of itself sufficiently gloomy. He must have been actuated by certain considerations in adopting this course of conduct, since the natural consequence of his statement was to bring under discussion the necessity of the departure of the Empress and her son, whom he had just exhibited to view as surrounded with dangers. Dismissing, in fact, the other subject, the discussion was now made to turn upon the question whether the Empress should remain in Paris or removed from it. The debate now began. The members of the council spoke as worthy Frenchmen, and as men strongly attached to the emperor and to the fabric he had raised. They developed all the danger that would attend the abandoning the capital to a hostile influence by removing from the citizens of Paris any interest they might feel in defending it, a circumstance which would come to pass as soon as they should find that they were not deemed worthy of being entrusted with the charge of protecting the empress and the little king of Rome, whom the emperor had made them swear to defend, and in whose name the National Guard of Paris had been placed under arms. It was observed that our remaining power was all centered in Paris, that its strength consisted in the presence of the sovereign in the midst of its population, which would display the most unbounded attachment on finding that every confidence was reposed in its zeal. The proposal was made of bringing the empress to the town hall at the moment of danger and showing her to the people in the streets, the suburbs, and the boulevards. This courageous opinion, which was offered to M. Boulet de la Murta, was supported by the whole council. M. de Talleyrand himself concurred in it. He stated the grounds of his opinion and did not disguise the possibility of a commotion, which nothing but the presence of the empress could allay. The Duc de Feltre spoke in his turn, and was of a contrary way of thinking. When he had concluded, the Duc de Massa presented certain considerations of an opposite tendency and urged them with great energy. I spoke in my turn and laid great strength upon the danger that might arise from the absence of the empress. I rested my opinion upon the favorable sentiments I knew to be prevalent amongst that part of the population which is held in least estimation and is nevertheless most disposed to endure every sacrifice. Silence pervaded the assembly for a few moments. The arch-chancellor collected the votes. All, with the exception of the minister of war, were for the empress remaining in Paris. The Duc de Feltre asked permission to speak and began a long discourse, which must be still fresh in the recollection of all who heard it. It has had too great an influence over our destinies not to render it necessary to notice its principal features. After a rather lengthy exordium, in which he quoted some facts derived from history and some traits of devotedness drawn from the same source, he made an application of our existing condition to that in which other sovereigns had been placed, who were compelled by the casualties of war to abandon their capitals. He insisted that it was a mistake to consider Paris as the center of the emperor's power. This power attended the prince wherever he went, so long as a village was left standing where he or his son should be acknowledged, there all Frenchmen ought to rally around his cause. That spot was their capital. The safety of the state ought not to be so hastily despaired of. For his own part, he was at a loss to conceive how men who had so long professed an attachment to the emperor's person could suggest the idea of exposing his son to fall into the hands of the enemy. This was the only bond of union between France and Austria. We should, he continued, have no farther resources left to us if we yielded to the treacherous suggestion of delivering up to the Greeks the offspring of our Hector.